Every morning, before you speak a single word, before you decide what to eat or where to go, you make a choice about who you want to be. You open a drawer, you reach for something, and without thinking too deeply about it, you put on a mask. Not a mask made of plastic or paint, a mask made of cotton, silk, or denim. Every human on Earth does this. Every single day, we are the only creatures who cover ourselves, not just to stay warm, but to become something, to project something, to hide something. Animals move through the world exactly as they are, but we layer ourselves before we walk out the door. So the question is not what we wear. The real question is, why do we feel so uncomfortable being seen as we truly are? To understand why we hide, we have to go back, far back, to a time before mirrors, before markets, before anyone had a word for fashion. For a long time, scientists assumed clothing began as survival. Cold weather, sharp terrain, the simple need to protect skin from the elements. And that explanation makes sense on the surface. It is logical, it is clean, but the evidence tells a more complicated story. Genetic research suggests that humans began wearing clothing somewhere between 100,000 and 170,000 years ago. And here is what makes that number interesting. It predates the last major ice age. In other words, our ancestors started covering themselves before the cold made it strictly necessary. Something else came first. Some researchers believe that something was the emergence of self-awareness. Around the same period, we start to see other behaviors appear in the archaeological record. Burial rituals, body paint, the arrangement of objects with symbolic meaning. Humans were not just surviving anymore. They were thinking about themselves. They were beginning to understand that others could see them, judge them, form an opinion of them. And with that awareness came a new and deeply human feeling, discomfort with being fully visible. Think about what that moment must have felt like. Not as a concept, but as a lived experience. You are standing among others. You notice that they notice you. And for the first time, you feel the weight of being observed. Not threatened by a predator. Observed by another person. Someone who can think, remember, and form a story about who you are. That feeling, that subtle, almost invisible discomfort, may be one of the oldest feelings our species has ever carried. And so we reached for something to place between ourselves and the world. In many of the earliest cultures we have record of, clothing was not primarily about warmth or modesty in the way we understand it today. It was ceremonial. It was protective in a spiritual sense. Animal skins were worn not just for insulation, but because wearing the skin of a powerful creature was believed to transfer something: strength, spirit, identity. The clothing did not cover who you were. It announced who you wished to become. Even the word persona, which we now use to mean the version of ourselves we show to others, comes from the Latin word for mask. The mask worn by actors in ancient theater, the face placed over the real face. From the very beginning, covering the body and constructing an identity were the same act. A young man in an ancient community putting on the feathers of a particular bird for a ritual was not so different from someone today choosing a specific jacket before an important meeting. Both are performing. Both are reaching for something external to shape how they are perceived. Both are, in their own way, trying to control what the world sees. The tools change. The instinct does not. And once that instinct became part of how humans move through society, once covering yourself became connected to how others understood you, something inevitable began to happen. Clothing stopped being personal. It became a system. Once clothing became connected to identity, it was only a matter of time before other people began to notice and to use that connection for their own purposes. If what you wear tells the world who you are, then controlling what people wear means controlling who they are allowed to be. This shift happened gradually, and it happened everywhere. Across ancient Egypt, Rome, China, and feudal Europe, societies began developing what historians call sumptuary laws, official rules that dictated what certain people could and could not wear. The color purple in ancient Rome was reserved exclusively for emperors. In medieval Europe, only nobility could wear fur-lined clothing. In feudal Japan, the length of a sword on your belt, the pattern on your robe, the color of your thread, all of it was regulated by law. Wearing the wrong thing was not just a social mistake. In some cases, it was a punishable offense. Think about what that reveals. These were not rules about warmth or practicality. They were rules about visibility. about who was allowed to appear powerful, wealthy, or important. Clothing had become a tool, not just for the person wearing it, but for the system organizing them, and the system was precise. A merchant who had earned great wealth could still be forbidden from wearing the fabrics that marked him as elite. A soldier who had won battles could be denied the colors of the ruling class. The body became a surface on which society wrote its own hierarchy. What you covered yourself with each morning was not your choice alone. It was a statement the world made about you, whether you agreed or not. This is the moment when something quietly shifted in the human relationship with clothing. Before, covering yourself was a personal act, born from self-awareness, from the desire to shape your own identity. But now, the meaning of what you wore was being decided from the outside. Other people, institutions, rulers, traditions were determining what your clothing was allowed to say. A young woman in 16th century England, for example, could not simply choose to wear velvet because she liked the way it felt. The fabric itself was legally assigned to a class above her. What she wore every day carried someone else's message about her place in the world, stitched directly into the cloth. And here's what makes this transition so significant. Most people simply accepted it, not because they were weak or unthinking, but because the system was total. When everyone around you dresses according to the same rules, those rules begin to feel natural. They begin to feel like reality itself, rather than a set of decisions someone once made. Clothing had done something remarkable. It had taken a deeply private act, the choice of how to present yourself, and turned it into a public language. A language with grammar, rules, and consequences for speaking it wrong. The person underneath the fabric had not changed, but the fabric now carried a weight far beyond warmth or modesty. It carried meaning that belonged to everyone except, sometimes, the person wearing it. There is a moment many people have experienced, though few talk about openly. You are standing in front of a mirror, fully dressed, ready to walk out the door. And for just a second, a brief, quiet second, you feel it. A small gap. A distance between the person looking back at you and the person you sense yourself to be somewhere deeper inside. The clothes are right. The image is acceptable. Maybe it is even impressive. But something does not quite fit, not the fabric. Something else. This is the hidden cost that clothing, and the long history behind it, has quietly built into daily life. We began covering ourselves to manage how others saw us. We allowed systems to dictate what our clothing was permitted to say. And somewhere along the way, we became so practiced at dressing for the world that we lost easy access to dressing for ourselves. The performance became the habit, and the habit became the self. Psychologists have long observed that what we wear genuinely changes how we feel and how we behave, not just how others perceive us. When a person puts on formal clothing, they tend to think more abstractly, hold themselves differently, speak with more careful control. The outside shapes the inside, which sounds, at first, like a kind of power. But it is also a kind of trap. If the clothes we wear each day are chosen to manage perception, to project confidence, we do not always feel status we are still reaching for. Calm we are not entirely sure we possess, then we are spending enormous quiet energy maintaining an image. And that energy comes from somewhere. It is borrowed from the part of us that simply wants to exist without being evaluated. Consider someone preparing for a job interview. They choose every item with deliberate care, the right level of formality, the right suggestion of competence, the right balance between approachable and serious. They are not simply getting dressed. They are constructing an argument, a case for why they deserve to be trusted. And the anxiety in that process is real because they understand, instinctively, that the person judging them will begin forming an opinion before a single word is spoken. Now consider that this, in smaller, quieter ways, is what most people do every single morning of their lives. We dress not just for comfort or warmth, but to manage the story others will tell about us. And in doing so, we participate in a kind of daily concealment. The philosopher Irving Goffman once described social life as a kind of performance, a theater in which we are all constantly playing roles for different audiences. Clothing, in this view, is not decoration. It is costume, and like any actor who has worn the same costume long enough, there comes a moment when you are no longer entirely sure where the role ends and you begin. That uncertainty is not weakness. It is one of the most human things there is. At some point in history, someone realized that the human need to manage appearance was not just a social instinct, it was a market. The industrialization of clothing in the 19th century changed everything. Before factories, most people owned very few garments. Clothing was expensive, time-consuming to produce, and built to last. What you wore was largely determined by what you could afford to make or repair. The question of identity through clothing existed, but it was constrained by reality. Then the machines arrived. By the late 1800s, mass production made fabric cheap and garments accessible in ways that had never existed before. And almost immediately, a new industry emerged alongside it. One dedicated not to making clothes, but to making people feel that the clothes they already owned were no longer enough. Fashion, as a system of deliberate seasonal change, was born not from creativity alone, but from commerce. The French fashion houses of the 19th century institutionalized the idea that style had an expiration date. What was elegant last season was ordinary this season. What was ordinary this season would be embarrassing by next year. The cycle was not natural. It was engineered. Today, the average person in a wealthy country buys roughly 68 items of clothing per year. The global fashion industry is valued at over $2 trillion. And fast fashion, the model of producing cheap, trend-driven clothing at enormous speed, has compressed the seasonal cycle into something closer to weekly. Some brands release new collections every single week of the year. What this means in practical terms is that the quiet human anxiety about being seen correctly, the ancient discomfort with full visibility that drove our earliest ancestors to reach for something to wear, has been identified, amplified, and sold back to us at scale. The system does not create the need. The need was always there, but the system learned to speak directly to it, fluently and without pause. A teenager scrolling through images on a phone late at night, feeling a vague dissatisfaction with everything in their wardrobe, is experiencing something real. That feeling has a name, a history, and a very clear set of commercial interests invested in keeping it alive. The clothes they own are not the problem, but the system surrounding them is expertly designed to make it feel that way. And most people participate willingly, not because they are naive, but because the rewards are genuine. A new item of clothing can produce a real, if temporary, sense of confidence, of possibility, of control over how the world receives you. The feeling is not imaginary. It is just brief. And so the cycle continues. The ancient instinct to cover, to present, to conceal, which began as a deeply personal response to self-awareness, now runs through one of the largest and most powerful industries on Earth. The distance between who we are and who we dress ourselves to appear has not closed. If anything, it has become an economy. Here is something worth sitting with for a moment. Every morning, you choose what to wear. And every morning, that choice carries the weight of everything we have talked about. Thousands of years of self-awareness, social systems, commerce, performance, and the quiet human discomfort with being fully seen. All of it compressed into a few minutes in front of a wardrobe. That is an extraordinary amount of history to carry before breakfast. But here's what I find quietly remarkable. Despite all of it, despite the systems, the rules, the industries built around our insecurity, the clothing we choose still tells the truth about us. Not in the way we intend, not in the careful, curated message we are trying to send, but in a deeper way. The person who wears the same comfortable jacket until it falls apart is saying something. The person who dresses with deliberate precision every single day is saying something. The person who stopped caring what they wear after significant loss, or who suddenly began caring again after finding new hope, they are saying something too. Something unscripted. Something closer to the bone than any fashion choice could ever be. We think we dress to conceal, and in many ways we do. But concealment is itself a form of revelation. What we choose to hide and how carefully we hide it, and what we allow to show through the edges. All of it speaks. The mask, worn long enough and chosen carefully enough, becomes a self-portrait. The ancient Romans were not wrong when they connected the word for mask with the word for person, because perhaps the self is not something that exists before the performance. Perhaps it is something that emerges through it, layer by layer, choice by choice, morning by morning. There is a story, small and ordinary, the kind that happens without anyone noticing, of an elderly man who, after his wife of 50 years passed away, continued to dress formally every single day. Press shirt, careful shoes, not because he was going anywhere, but because she had always loved to see him that way. In his grief, the clothing was not concealment. It was continuity, a private conversation with someone no longer there to hear it. That is not performance. That is something else entirely. And it makes me wonder whether the question we started with, why do humans hide their true nature, is perhaps the wrong question, because maybe we are not hiding it all. Maybe every layer we add, every choice we make about how to present ourselves to the world is actually an attempt at the opposite. An attempt, however imperfect, to be understood, to be seen, not as we accidentally are, but as we deeply wish to be. The body beneath the clothing has not changed in 100,000 years. The same skin, the same vulnerability, the same quiet hope that when someone looks at us, they will see something worth seeing. We have just spent all of human history trying to help them see it correctly, and perhaps that is not something to be ashamed of. Perhaps that is simply what it means to be the kind of creature that is aware of being watched, and brave enough every single morning to get dressed anyway. Until next time, my friends, sleep well and stay curious.